Catherine II, the Poles, the Cossacks, the Crim Tartars. Who else? The Magyars. I know some Hungarians and they tell me to say it like this, something like Muja. I don't know how to say it. I'm not Hungarian. I'm not Russian. I'm not Polish. I'm Australian. But who else have we got? Oh, I mentioned the Tatars, the Mongols. I've been on the steppe. The episode previous to this one was called Maria Theresa in the end, and I felt that that episode needed a follow-up, and this is it. And I thought I should give it a long title, like the one I just spoke out, Catherine II, Poland, the Tartars, and so on and so forth. Have a title for your thing, your YouTube thing, that's just that long. But I'll just call it Catherine II, because that's quicker. And I'll just call it Catherine, because the previous one was called Maria Theresa. I'll get a set going. Okay. And I've been on the steppe a lot lately. I've been in the East. I've been in Central and Eastern Europe, but I've been even further beyond, right across to Mongolia and Japan and everywhere. Look, this is just for a bit of fun. And all right, so in the previous episode, I'm in Hungary mostly at the moment. Hungary. And speaking of the steppes, I always assumed, and this is absolutely serious, that the Hungarians derived from the Huns, because the word Hungarian, but no. Seems like a coincidence. And it's like a double coincidence too, because, geez, I almost sounded Irish. It's almost a double, Scottish or something. But turns out, not, apparently. As far as you look, no. Do you know the funny thing about the steppe and the steppes? I don't know if there's one of them or if there's lots of them. I think they call them the steppes. There'd be the steppe, Steppe, upon which, the Mongols are today, to this day. And there'd be another steppe upon which the Central Asia sits, and so on and so forth. But with the Hungarians, I thought they came from the Huns, but they don't. But it was a double whammy, really. I was double confused, because not only does it sound similar, Hun and Hungarian, you would think that, Hungary was named after the Huns, but the Huns themselves, Attila the Hun and all those guys, they used to be where Hungary is now, and Hungary appears to be not named after them. That's weird, but you roll with it. You've got to roll with a lot of things when you're on the steppes, and this is something I've tried to relax into. You can want to know. I'm imagining if I was a Pole, Now, Poland, as we know and love it, appears to be about 1,000 years old, 1,100 years old. The one we know now, but it has changed a lot, most definitely. And Russia, if I was Russian, I'd like to know, where did Russia come? Has it been here? Have we been like this forever? Here on our part of the steppe or the open plains since the ice ages. If I was Polish, I would sort of say the same thing. Have we sort of been here forever? If I was Indigenous Australian, I'd probably say, fairly good idea. I've been here for a long time, but but not forever. Unless in my imaginings, I make it so, which you can do, and I'm actually not against that. But wherever I've been lately, I've relaxed into the idea, I've relaxed into the idea that don't try and nail down the steps. Don't say, because I think it's everyone's best guess. I'm just hearing this as news. It's not my knowledge, it's news I'm hearing. I listen to history books. You can do that these days. You don't have to read them. I listen to a lot of them. And it's people's best guess. What are their names? That's what Margaret Thatcher would say. She'd say, these people of whom you speak, what are their names? You can't just go saying people say. Yeah, but I will. I hear that people's best guess is that the ancestors of the Hungarians, ethnically speaking, it's dangerous using the word ethnicity in conjunction with the modern idea of the word nation, but let's roll with it. It's people's best guess that the ancestors of the Hungarians, who seem pretty clearly to be the Magyars mostly, might have come from the Urals. And how do they track that? Well, look, linguistically mainly. They have a language that is very is a faint echo of a language that might have existed a long time ago, that is an echo of the language that is spoken by modern Estonians, as it turns out, and of modern Finns, people from Finland. But all the languages of Eurasia essentially are related even further back than that, but come forward or get up the tree a little bit, and the Finns and the Estonians and the Hungarians, they seem to be off on the same branch. But one way or another, I'm not even going to bother finding out, but there are some clever clogs out there who have had a guess that the Hungarians arise from somewhere up in the Ural Mountains, which is a strip of mountains in between, down to the east of Moscow, basically. And you sort of think, all right, so at some stage, look, I'm happy to roll with that. There was a group that was on the steppe or in the mountains, in the Urals somewhere, and they were the Magyars, and they, for some reason, they seem to have migrated holus bolus away from that area, because apparently there's no one who speaks that anymore, anything like that. in that area. But see, there might be ethnically, there might be people who DNA. They could do DNA tests now, but that might be different than finding a linguistic connection. You could have a DNA connection, and what's a DNA connection worth? And what's a linguistic connection worth? What are you going to rest your identity on if you are a Hungarian? What are you going to rest your identity on if you're a Pole? Or, indeed, a Russian, or a Mongolian even, or anything. I think people tend to, it reminds me actually, as I'm thinking about that, of theology. And theology is, you start with a premise, like God created the world, okay? A thinking God created the world, and he knows your name and he loves you. Now, I'm not one of those people that has a problem with that. I'm a bit loosey-goosey, left, right and centre, which is kind of annoying, because you can't pin me down very easily. But nation identifying can be a little bit like that, as far as I can tell. So say you're a Pole, and there's something in it for you. You want to know that, because you come from the area that is now Poland a long way back anyway, and you kind of know that, because the history of Poland emerges out of the area roughly where it is right now about 1,000 years ago. A little bit more than that now. And you want to sort of say, all right, we know we belong to here. Going back 1,000 years, I like the idea that we actually have been here forever. Back to the flood, back to the Ice Age, back even further, and you sort of enter into a process of theology, almost nationology, where you go looking for the evidence for that, and you can find it, and you can do that no matter where you come from, almost. But at the same time, your identity might rest on a nation that has you somewhere else and not on this piece of dirt. That's what I do here in Australia, because I know my ancestors didn't come from here, they came from somewhere else, but I feel that that's my nation which moved over to here, and now here I am, and my nation goes back 40,000 years, my nation goes back 100,000 years, my nation goes back a long way. I'm ancient. Well, one thing we all know is we're ancient. We all know we go back an awful long way, back to when we were getting it on with the Neanderthals. We know that much. So there's no problem for anyone in the world, on the sort of antecedents side of things. There goes a Ferrari. Can you hear it? There's no problem saying you go back and back and back and back. Like you could be, we all go back and back and back, but people like to say that my group goes back and back and back. And I think that's nice. I'm not against theology. I'm not against nationology. And sometimes, like say the Hungarians, because they're the ones I'm interested in the most at the moment, you might say, that might be more powerful for you, the fact that you did come from somewhere else and came to where Hungary is now, which is roughly called the Carpathian Basin, and you've built a nation, like you were from the steppes and you came here to the very edge of the steppes, to this place called the Carpathian Basin. I suspect there are Carpathian mountains around and there's a basin in the middle. Just It's like Sunbury is the Sunbury Basin with the Sunbury Hills around, you know. And as long, I think we like to know, you know, or even reasonably well know where we come from, and it gives us a sense of belonging to a tribe or something, or a nation, whatever you want to call it. Now, is it a problem if you're not absolutely sure? Exactly, you know. So I think no. I think everyone can relax into, look, the fact that there were no records on the step is gold, really, because you can make it so. It's a bit difficult when there's actual evidence, you know, which pops up. But then again, that's good too, because everyone everyone adjusts their thinking and say, right, that proves, you know, I'll adjust my identity slightly to fit that evidence, but I'll still fill in the gaps. I haven't got a problem with that. We all need to get by. But when it comes to the steps, those guys, they seem to have been in a constant state of flux the more I listen to it, you know. And I don't get too bogged down at this point. Number one, you know, whether, the Muscovites, for example, can trace themselves back in a nice, very solid line all the way back to the Ice Age or not. But for me as an outsider looking in, I'm not from there, not recently anyway. Look, apparently I come a little bit from a lot, whatever, from the British Isles, whatever, mostly Ireland apparently, but you know, that's okay. But where did they come from? You know, and there's lots of archaeology and linguistics and all that sort of stuff, and I hear ideas, you know, I hear things about Beaker people. I might be a Beaker person, you know. I hear about short, dark, stocky people from the Mediterranean having gone across to Ireland in Neolithic times, and you know, and they might be the original Irish. And I hear of the Celts, you know, which might have been peoples from Central Europe which came across to Ireland, or maybe just the culture came across to Ireland. And I hear of Vikings come from the land of the ice and snow and all that. I hear of Vikings coming raiding into Ireland and becoming a bit of a ruling class in Dublin, but then becoming conquered by the locals a little bit culturally and starting to identify as Irish, and you know, modern Ireland, the modern Irish Dubliner, because apparently a lot of my blood apparently comes from Dublin, but everywhere else in Ireland as well. But you know, and so I might have a bit of Viking in me, but whatever. You almost have to relax into the idea that who you are you've emerged from a non-solid sort of spot in the world. Even this Neanderthal bit, you know, like people do DNA testing and all that sort of thing, and they find out that we Euros apparently have got a little bit of Neanderthal in us, and you would think that that might make us feel a little bit anxious. You know, you sort of look at your forehead and you say, are my eyebrows sticking out a little bit, you know? You start to do that, you know? You say, have I got a neck? I wonder if it's long enough. You know, maybe if my ancestors hadn't sort of got it on with the Neanderthals, my neck might have been a little bit longer, you know? But as it is, I'm worried. But then we adjust and we adapt and we sort of say to ourselves, we might even say to ourselves, that's made me better. The fact that I've got a bit of Neanderthal in me, because I bet they were strong. And I reckon they might have had, you start doing that nationology thing, the theology thing, you sort of say, oh, Neanderthal, it makes me feel a little bit superior. I bet they were strong, and that's just what I needed. I was already smart, but I just needed to be a little bit stronger, and, maybe that's where I got my guns, You start thinking along like that, and and I think if you're in Poland, for example, because they've got an idea that, well, it's true, that they're essentially Slavic. What is Slavic? Well, here's the thing about the steppe in Central Europe and Eastern Europe and all that. These are words. You get this idea of a certain mega group of people called the Slavs. But then you break it down and there's Eastern Slavs and there's those Slavs over there that are Poland and all that sort of stuff. Eastern Slavs might be they're the Russians and the Ukrainians and the Belarusians. But then, you hear of people in the ancient times referring to the people up there towards Russia or whatever, or above the Black Sea or something, as Scythians. And then you hear some people, where did all these words come from? They must have come from somewhere, unless someone was making them up. I doubt that everyone was making them up. They would have some sort of, like even the word Greece. The Greeks themselves don't call themselves the Greeks. They're the Hellenes, if anything. But as far as the Italians were concerned, the kind of Greeks that were, the kind of Hellenes that were closest to them was a tribe of Grecians. I think that was the tribe or something, and they just called them all Greeks. And we people in the West tend to do that, but I've noticed up in Russia, who sort of come at Greece from the north, looking at them, kind of think of them as the Hellenes. I don't hear the word Greece when I'm in Russia very often. I'm in Russia a lot. I was in Poland recently. I travel in my mind. I'm in Hungary now, but you don't find people up there saying the word Greece very often. They say the Hellenes. Now, that's what I've heard anyway. But look, words are good to have. So, I don't know where the word Magyar comes from. And this is to do with Huns, of course. But it'll. I'm comfortably satisfied that it comes. There's some reason that some people have decided to say that the original Hungarians were the Magyars, and I'm comfortably satisfied that there's a good reason that we started calling them Hungarians too after that. I don't know what that reason is, but there'll be a good reason. I don't have to know everything. But I've learnt to be a bit loosey-goosey in not trying to nail down all the mobs of the steppe. I got a feeling they were in a constant state of flux a little bit. So the Magyar nation came from the Urals. Now, if I was a Hungarian, I would like to think, I would enjoy thinking, I would want to think, probably, I would like to think that I've got a nice, simple history. We are in modern-day Hungary now, but our people came from the Urals, and we were there in the Urals. That single, well-defined culture, the echoes of which are in my personality right now, including the language, and it was a very discrete, well-defined thing, a tribe, a group in the Urals, and it went back and back and back to the Ice Age, and back even further well before then. We go back and back forever, as long as humans have been in that area. And if I was a Russian, I might want to think the same thing, and I might, but and a Pole too. Now, and yet other people call the people who we call Russians now, Scythians, apparently. But there's other, I have a brain explosion of all these names I hear, like Tatars even. Now, I don't know exactly who they all were across what is now modern day Russia, which stretches right across the top of Eurasia. And then under there you've got Kazakhstan and Mongolia, I know that much. And then you've got Central Asia going through to China over there, and going through what? Middle East is off there, you know? And Hungary and all that, and Austria and all that's over there. But the point is, if, you know, like Mongolia, how far does that go back? Well, Mongolia, the famous version of Mongolia pretty much goes back to the person of Genghis Khan. But before that, there was the culture of steppe people from which Genghis Khan emerged. And you wouldn't say that was exactly the same culture as the one he created after that, because he was so significant and he changed everything. There would have been, and that sort of flux and change and all that sort of stuff would have been a feature of the steppes right throughout. You know, I think China, I get the sense that China kind of can see itself as a well-defined thing in its, within its current boundaries of the modern nation state of China, and they can sort of theologize and nationologize that these are the boundaries of China, and we can trace that going back to the Ice Ages and back even further before, and to long before then. But it wouldn't have been like that, I would say, because I'm vaguely conscious. See, I talked about these groups like Mongols and Scythians and Slavs and Magyars and Tatars. What else is there? The Turkic people. And who was I talking about just then? Oh, the Chinese. And then there was Uyghurs and Uzbeks, and I'm thinking of countries, the names of countries at the moment, because the names of countries these days would probably have echoes of ancient tribes in the names of those countries. Kazakhs, Kazakhstan, Ukraine. I think there's a relatively modern world, but there was a discrete culture around there. Crimea, the Krim Tatars. There's groups everywhere, all fluxing, and conquering each other and migrating, so on and so forth. And I think if you come from, if you're descendant from the steppes, I think, and the Huns, the Mongols think that they're, as part of the Mongol theology, the nationology, that they are descended from the Huns, the people of the sun. And look, one way or another, one thing we kind of do know is, out of all of the moving of peoples and nations rising and falling, and states rising and falling, and cultures rising and falling, and merging and breaking and getting wiped out, genocide and all that sort of stuff, that wherever you come from that whole swirl, but that's not enough, I think, from most people. They kind of want to identify themselves from within that swirl. And it doesn't matter if, the more you can do that, the better. It's a nice feeling, and I don't think it's a negative and a bad feeling, although it tends to make one mob want to kill another mob because they're on our land, when quite possibly it's everybody's land. They were all in the swirl, and then history kicks in, and it emerges from the mists of myth and legend, and at that moment when, whoever, Poland emerges from the mists of myth and legend. At that moment in time, there are a certain discrete kind of culture, a nation, if you like, and you sort of say, "Oh, yeah, this area is Poland's," and it's not a bad thing. The merging thing is interesting because I think, from what I hear, Poland, for example, is basically emerges from the mists of memory as a kind of Slavic people, but then another mob comes up from the Black Sea or that area, kind of an Iranian, which has echoes of the word Aryan, Iranian group. There's just hundreds of groups, and it's not a great idea to try it. Well, for me anyway, I don't like to nail it down too much, so what's the point? But apparently, look, it's good to know all these words, because even if you doubt that the Poles are what they think they are, or the Russians are what they think they are, and so on and so forth, and the Hungarians are what they think they are, there's some reality to be had in who they think they are, and you've got to roll with that a little bit, because there's a reality in that. Even if they're wrong, it's a kind of it's a story that they tell themselves, and it's probably based on a whole lot of truth anyway. And anyway, the fact that they believe it creates its own reality, because arising out of them, stories they tell themselves, the myths and the legends, they tend to, like, let's say there's some great figure who is slightly mythical, like King bloody whatever his name is in England, of the Round Table. Then what's his name? Sword. I'm not even in England at the moment. My brain is out of that space. Arthur. He might be slightly mythical and legendary, but the point is, there's nothing to stop someone putting him on a stamp, a British stamp, and the fact that there is a King Arthur sitting on a British stamp tells a story, a real story, that this is part of the history, the real history of England now, whether he existed or not. And he becomes relevant, he becomes a real person in a certain way, like you don't want to get too hung up on whether people really existed, like Jesus, you don't want to get too hung up, in my opinion, on whether he actually existed the way that people sketch him, back in the day. You don't want to get too hung up on that, but the point is, real humans have come up with this character called Jesus, and you can believe in that character. And I don't know how much it matters if he was a real person. Maybe he was just a mashup of 4 street preachers at the time, and one of those street preachers, he was a very peachy guy. One of those street preachers gave a speech, that was, one of them got crucified. One of them, what's that? Blessed are the cheesemakers. Another one. They were 2 different people, but they merged them and called it Jesus. You can have that. And one of them healed a leper, apparently, but only one. Only one leper. The next leper came down the street, said, "Can you cure me? Can you cure me too?" And Jesus said, "I'm all out of leper curing potion." Jesus, when he turned that water into wine at that wedding in Canaan, he would have been invited to the next wedding, wouldn't he? And they probably, all they did was brought big vats full of water, urns full of pottery full of water to the wedding, and they sat it there. "Hello, Jesus, welcome. We haven't brought any wine, but would you mind? Yeah, a bit of a wave the wand. And he said, I'll only do each trick once. What? We wouldn't have invited you. And why would you only do it once anyway? But anyway, the thing about, with the Hungarians is, regardless of where they really literally do come from, I don't think it's helpful, and this applies to the Poles, the Russians and everyone else anyway. It doesn't really help to say, there's significant doubt as to where you came from, so you don't get to talk about your history. You don't get to talk about that history at all. It has no meaning. It's all a load of crap. A little bit like some people say that to people who follow Jesus. Look, you got no proof that he existed, so it's all a load of crap. But there's a hell of a lot of amazing stuff about the stories, whether they're true or not, and what's good about the stories, whether they be the stories of the Magyars coming from the Ural Mountains, where they might have come from. There's such great stories that there's something valuable to be had with them, and they can form a very solid basis for your current day reality. It doesn't matter so much if things are real. The most famous detective in the world never existed. Well, I think it'd be unequivocal that Sherlock Holmes is the most famous detective in the world, and you can get to know him, and he can make your life a lot richer, Sherlock Holmes, getting to know him. So why not Jesus too? And why not this origin story you've got of the Magyars, who are your people who came from the Urals and were in the Urals, and that's where you come from, and there's a certain truth to be had in it, and you can build a nation around that, I think. Well, it doesn't matter whether one agrees with that or not, because people just do it anyway. Right, so one might, after having had all that chatter into one's phone, sort of say to yourself, all right, I can start sort of talking about the Hungarians as a nation that, in the stories they tell themselves, which are not to be disrespected, and that's the key. People disrespect people a lot, but I would respect this story that they might have come from the Urals. And if I knew some Hungarians, and I do, lots of them, I know lots of Hungarians, I'm related to them, and I would say just build an identity around that, because it's a good story, and it would have, as far as I'm concerned, it's probably got a basis of truth. I'd say it's more than a basis of truth. I'd say there's a lot of truth in it, almost certainly. And look, just build your nation around that. Build your identity around it. Enjoy it. That's what I'd say. But as to, these people who come from the steppe, I'd also be a little bit, this is a story, a thing I tell myself, not to whoever. I don't intend for there to be any listener or watcher of who would come with me on this ride here in this gazebo in Queen's Park. It's beautiful here. All the way as far into this episode as 39 minutes and 18 seconds. I doubt that anyone will watch this far into this, because I'm speaking slower in this episode than I usually do in some other episodes. But I kind of speak into this thing just so, not because I need anyone to listen to it, or it's the fact that I might as well as not, and it's quite nice that I've sat here and I've spoken something into the universe, and that I've even had these thoughts. It's a pretty zen thing, You know, it's like, and even if I never listen to this again, and even if nobody else does, the fact is, it came to be. This whole thing that's going on in my head today, it came to be, and I put it down on YouTube, and there's something nice and zen about that, and it's got nothing to do with why you even doing it. You're doing it because you're doing it for its own sake. Why would you write a book? Well, some people say, let's say you wanted to write a book about something, a novel or whatever, and someone might say, but, you say, I'm desperate to write a book before I die. And they say, but nobody's going to read it. And I say, yeah, but I'm still desperate to do it. But why would you want to do it if no one's going to read it, probably? I say, because there's so many people writing books in the world these days, and even AI is writing books these days, and nobody would even be sure whether you wrote it or AI wrote it, for example, right at the moment. And you sort of say, yeah, but it's not about that. It's not about whether even, maybe I won't even put my name to it. It's the fact that I existed. I found myself to be alive, which is an absolute amazing sort of experience, and what to me seems like a miracle. And I just thought I'd use that opportunity to write a book, even if it's not read by anyone, because then a book came to be that, had I not written it, wouldn't have come to be. And I'm thinking about the value of that book existing for its own sake, which seems mad, but I think Buddhists would understand. I'm not a Buddhist. All right. So, I've noticed this about the steppes a lot. Nations coming along, you get hints of nations having existed in the past. Without getting into modern day current politics, take the area around Ukraine at the moment. It came to be, it's a long story, but the Mongols went over there. The Mongols merged with the Tatars. They kind of subjugated the Tatars. They're two different mobs over further to the east. And the Mongols at some stage under Genghis Khan, brought a neighbouring mob called the Tatars under the Mongols. Okay. They brought a lot more under the Mongols than just the Tatars too. But we'll just talk about the Tatars for a second. And then eventually Genghis Khan died, and he kind of left his empire. He split it up into 4 khanates, really. And one of those khanates was the Golden Horde, which headed out across to the east in the direction of what was then called Muscovy and Kiev, which I used to call Kiev, Chicken Kiev, but it's Chicken Kiev now. And for all the places I've been visiting lately, which is, Russia, Poland, Sweden, and now Hungary, this group of people from the steppe become relevant because they had to interact with them. They had to come under them, as it turns out. And locally, this mob up here, the Mongolian Empire was split into 4, really. One lot sort of took China, and that ended up under the control of Kublai Khan, who became a bit Chinese. A little bit like when the Vikings went to Ireland, like I mentioned before, I think they became a bit Irish. That happens everywhere. And the Vikings went across too. So I'm reading texts that are coming through as well, because you can see that as you're talking into this thing, you keep getting these little notifications. But and then Vikings kind of went down to where modern day Normandy, is it Normandy? Can't even remember, is. And they became the Normans, but they kind of intermingled. Sometimes you can conquer a land, but then they conquer you culturally. So the Vikings went across to Muscovy, what we would call Muscovy these days, and Kiev and Rus, as we would call it these days. But they weren't called anything to do with the word Rus back before the Vikings came. But when the Vikings came, they kind of became the elites in those areas, and subjugated the Slavs locally, but then culturally they kind of started integrating with the Slavs they were subjugating, and it's this business of conquering a land but then becoming conquered by it culturally, and same with the Poles. It seems like a group from the steppe down below came up, and they were called the Sarmatians, which are kind of an Iranian kind of mob. And they came up and they subjugated the Slavs in the area that we now know as Poland. And the Polish, kind of have an origin story that has it that they are kind of a blend of these Sarmatians and the original Slavs, where the Sarmatians were the overlords and the Slavs were the peasants. But then, and that's the way it was. And people who were Polish were probably the Sarmatian nobility, and the Slavs weren't even Polish probably. And that might, because they were just chattels. That can happen, everyone thinks that just because you come from an area that you were the ruling class, but you could have been the peasants. In fact, you're probably a split. It's like people who modern day Spartans, and they say, I am descended from the mighty Spartans. But the Spartans had a lot of slaves who were Greek as well. And I don't think they referred to them as Spartans, but anyone who kind of ended up, a couple of thousand years down the track in that area, they'd be. Now, I think the slaves outnumbered the Spartans' slaves outnumbered the Spartan elite 7-1. So if you're from Sparta, you're probably 7 parts slave and 1 part strong. But everyone sort of says, oh no, I'm 100% descended from those strong ones. Oh, I'm not a peasant. But, Poland, Russia, Hungary, all these places, there's other places too. They can build a nice solid nation based on the stories they tell themselves. But those stories don't have to be disrespected, they can be respected, and they would have a lot of truth. They would arise from a lot of truth. So there is the Poles have clearly got a different character compared to the people of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, because they've all got a Viking flavour over there. They've all got the word Rus in their name: Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. Ukraine Rus. Whereas Poland hasn't got the word Rus in it. It's not called Poland Rus. It's called, all right, not Ukraine Rus, Kievan Rus. How's that sound? Kevin Rudd. And, but the Polands know they're different. They know they're different from, significantly different in sort of outlook from those other 3 mobs, the Belarusians and the Russians and the Ukrainians. That's partly because of reality. They did have different overlords, it would appear that's true, but also they know that they had different overlords and they adjust their personalities to match, I'd say. But you also get these other nations arising in these lands that me as an outsider would respect. So, when those Tatars came across and subjugated the Rus lands, they destroyed Kievan Rus, but they encouraged Muscovy Rus, and because they used to cut a deal, the Mongols, and they used to say, come under our laws, and we will give you protection, you give us money, and we will let you keep your culture, keep your gods, whatever you want, and you'll live in peace. Do this, that's option 1. Option 2 is die. We will destroy you. Now, Kievan Rus, for example, rejected the deal and said, we will fight, and they got wiped out. And the whole area of Kievan Rus was turned into a wasteland. And the area of Muscovy accepted the deal, and they did very well out of it, and kind of led to the rise of Moscow. As we know it now, it's kind of stronger than Ukraine now. And it used to be the other way around. The Kievan Russes were more big deal, and the Muscovites were a bit on the fringe. But that turned around, and that had a lot to do with the Mongols, and the fact that the Muscovite princes in that area accepted the deal, and the Kievan princes, who were the mightier princes, the grander princes, they rejected the deal and they got wiped out. Now, as it turns out, the Tatars have come over, they've destroyed Kievan Rus. And what's happened there is kind of a lot of Tatars. There's a nice little spot down there called Crimea. And the Tatars went and settled there, these invaders. The whole area was destroyed anyway, and they formed a nation in there. Now, if I was a Russian, or whatever, from that area, I would say they don't belong there. They're from afar. But then again, I'm here in Australia. I've only been here for 100 years. The bloody Crim Tatars, the Crimean Tatars, were there for a lot longer than my people have been here in Australia. But I feel I belong here. So it doesn't take long for a nation to build itself and become real. That's a very funny thing. And what happened was, you did get this mob of Tatars who settled in that area of what we now call Crimea, and I would say that they were a genuine nation. Now, if I was a Russian, I'd say no, they don't belong here. There's a movie that was made not far from here with Russell Crowe in it called Romper Stomper, and I just remember this one scene of someone who was a bit like me, except it was Russell Crowe. He's fatter than me now. I'm finally better looking than him. No, he's my age exactly, believe it or not. Now, right? I keep an eye on him and Tom Cruise. We're all the same age, the three of us. Now, those two guys are the losers because they're the only guys who don't know me. And there was a scene in Romper Stomper, and it's got someone who looks like me who lives near here, and it's a movie. It's neo-Nazi he is, Russell Crowe in this. I think to break out of stereotypes, Russell Crowe did two movies at the time, and one he was a complete gay. It was a funny movie. And the other one, he was a neo-Nazi. That's not a bad idea. I should do that. Become a neo-Nazi and become gay. And then the world's my oyster, because I've got a wide spectrum then, I can be anything in between. I'll think about it. Anyway, but he's got this Asian, and he's looking at his eye, and keeping in mind that we Aussies, Russell Crowe's a New Zealander, same thing. He says, this is not your country. This is not your country, to this Asian guy, menacingly, because he's a neo-Nazi. And if I was a Russian, I'd be saying that to the Tatars. This is not your country. I'd go down to Crimea and say, this is not your country. And, the Crim Tatars might say, you've never been here either. It was you're a different mob than the Kievan. This is not your, and then there'd be a fight. I don't want to get too, I'm not interested in current politics. But the point is, there was a nation that grew up, and they were called the Crim Tatars, and they were very real. It's a real nation. You sort of think, you can't have nations just rising out of nowhere, but which nation didn't? From what I was saying before, how do you know, when did the Slavs rise in that area? When did the Poles, when did the, the Mongols, the Mongols might have even started recently with Genghis Khan, as we know them. What's wrong with a nation just arising out of nowhere, even coming from afar, like the Magyars came down to Hungary? Why not the Tatars across to Crimea, and that becomes a genuine country and a total proper nation? And Russians, they might be a little bit like neo-Nazis, and the Ukrainians might be too, and that just proves I'm not getting into politics. And they might say, both the Ukrainians and the Russians might gang up on the Tatars and say, what are you doing here? You don't belong here. That's the way Russell Crowe put it, if he was a neo-Nazi. But Zelensky actually has been reaching out to Tatars, actually, saying, oh, look, if I got Crimea back, I would welcome you back. You can be a little bit cynical about that, But maybe he's telling the truth, I don't know. The Tatars were wiped out of that area. And the history of the world is a lot about people getting wiped out of areas. They were wiped out of there. Peter the Great got rid of a lot of them. I think the easiest way to get rid of people is to kill them, but you can also deport them and you can encourage them to go. Maybe an approach that is all those three things combined. That works. The Jews were just wiped out of Poland. That was unbelievable. I had no idea. Every third person in Warsaw before World War II was Jewish, as far as I read. And, they're saying like 31% or something. At some other stage, it's 38%. And now it's like, I looked it up, 0.21% of Polish people are Jews. That's nuts. That's genocide, And the Tatars were genocided out of Crimea too. Peter the Great. But also Stalin, he mopped up the rest of them. I think there's very few left. It happened here in Tasmania. It happened here in Australia, I think I knew a bloke who was a Tasmanian Aborigine, but as far as I used to work for him, and Bob, his name was, and but that was a genocide, really, of a sort. Look, I'm nearly up to an hour. I tell myself, if your timer on your thing, if you've been talking for an hour, that's enough. So I'll finish off now. I don't know what I was going to talk about. I think I was going to talk about Catherine the Great. Oh yeah. I can tell you a few things I was going to talk about. Actually, I was going to talk about, and I won't, whether or not, in the wasteland that was Kiev and Rus, whether in that land, and Crimea, absolutely destroyed, there was a mob there called the Krim Tatars. Were they a real country? I would say yes. But then, I might talk to a Russian, they might say no, and I might talk to a Ukrainian, and he might say no too. But there was another mob too called the Cossacks, and that, I'd look into them another day. And they really did seem to form a nation, and they were caught between two empires, Poland, Lithuania on the left, geographically with our left, right, north, east, south, west, north, and Muscovy on the right, and they were squeezed, but they were a real nation. What I would call a sovereign nation. But you might talk to a Russian and they might say the idea of a sovereign Russia, a sovereign nation that's not part of Russia existing in Ukraine is impossible. They might say that, and they're not real. Any nation that is in the Rus lands that calls itself a sovereign nation is not a real nation. It's a made-up nation. And I think Catherine the Great was saying that, and Peter the Great before her too, that the Cossacks were not a real nation, and they saw them off too. But the idea of a real nation is a tricky one. Is modern Ukraine a real nation? Zelensky would say yes, and Putin would say no. But then again, if there are, is Australia a real nation? And I'd say yes. That's a nice way to finish off, I think.